Thank you.
I've often thought it's an extraordinary privilege to be an English professor at Caltech, but at the moment I feel like there's nothing quite like being Bill Gates at Caltech. I thought we would start, given the energy we're feeling from the audience, with a selfie.
All right.
A group selfie.
I can do this.
Little enthusiasm, yeah. Come together.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you. As some of you may know, Bill Gates spent part of his day touring the Caltech campus. So I thought I'd start by just asking you what you saw. You obviously visited some of the labs that our undergraduate and graduate students work in. What interested you and what did you learn?
Well, I met with 3 different groups doing biology, and of course for our the Gates Foundation work, understanding the latest tools of biology and the insights so that we can take all the infectious diseases and eventually get rid of those. It's very exciting to me. So I started out with a group that's using optogenetics to look at the brain. It's pretty amazing. They use a viral vector AAV to actually get into particular parts of the brain and then see the signaling systems. They have ways of making the brain, getting rid of the lipids so it's more visible. That's pretty amazing. Then I met with a group that is looking at infection. In this case, they're using cystic fibrosis and seeing these various bacteria that grow over time. And unfortunately, that's still a fatal disease. There's particular kinds of bacterium that grow over time. They form these biofilms, and they have a certain way of getting energy that's actually very different than was expected. So that group is it's pretty phenomenal, the ideas that are coming out of that. And then the last biology thing was understanding neurodegeneration. The energy system in our cells are driven by mitochondria, and over time, the DNA there isn't as accurately copied as the normal DNA. And so the question is, okay, how does that affect neurodegeneration, other aging diseases, and how could you intervene? So that was fantastic to see that work. Then I went over and saw some of the energy work where they're taking sunlight and making fuels, and super impressed with that as well.
Yeah, well, the connections with the Gates Foundation work are clear. One of the things that strikes me, though, is one takes it for granted among college students, among graduate students, that there's a certain kind of curiosity, a hunger for knowledge, and what's going to come next. But we don't always associate that with every stage of our life. And I wonder what it is that keeps you curious and keeps you fascinated with technology and progress in the way that you are.
Well, I'm super lucky. You know, I've had really just 2 jobs in my life. I was about 14 when I got obsessed with computers and, you know, what could they do and not do. And the timing was kind of perfect because the microprocessor was coming along, which provided literally more than a factor of million of supply of computation capability. And so the qualitative nature of what was interesting to do with software changed. And a few young people, including myself and some others, saw that. And so we were the pioneers of getting the graphics interface and the software to be out there. That reinforced for me the idea that if you are curious, if you can hire other very capable people and take on big challenges, that you can see unbelievable results. And so Microsoft was incredibly successful. Now for my second job, I'm taking the wealth that success created and coincidentally, the wealth of Warren Buffett, and saying, okay, how can my wife and I build an institution that takes that wealth, hires very smart people, gets scientists to think about these problems, and actually takes, as was mentioned, the global health challenges, which we do a lot of things around that, and then education to make those better. And here again, there are cases where, like the Green Revolution, where Norman Borlaug was able, through his curiosity and persistence, to make a big difference. Or a guy named Jim Grant who got vaccine coverage to go up, or Henderson who was involved in the smallpox eradication. So there's amazing examples of how life has improved because of a combination of science and then actually going out and applying that in the field. And so part of the reason, A, it's fun to be curious, B, my job includes time to sit with amazing scientists, or nowadays online, I can watch courses day and night. I feel so much more empowered to learn than when I was young. When I was young, it was the Encyclopedia Britannica, or actually the World Book in my case, and it was alphabetical. So, and there were no movies, and so now I envy people who have that curiosity. There's so many free courses. There's a company called The Learning Company who I love to watch all of their lectures. And so if you have a job that you can, things you figure out, you can actually fund great people and see great results, I think that reinforces it. And so it helps you maintain sort of a youthful view of curiosity.
Great. So obviously, you mentioned that you've had two jobs, and most everyone knows about your first job at Microsoft. But I think more and more people are becoming familiar with and excited about the work of the Gates Foundation, particularly in global health and development. So I wonder if you could just share with us a few of the current initiatives coming out of the foundation that are important to you.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about how this wealth would be spent in my 20s and 30s, where it was becoming clear that it'd be a substantial amount of resources, I wasn't sure. I thought it would certainly have something to do with science. And fortunately, I got to read about the incredible inequity in health and how there's still diseases out there killing more than 1 million people a year. And in fact, there was this problem that, let's take malaria, that the countries who have malaria deaths don't have the resources or the scientific expertise to come up with the overall approach, including drugs and vaccines, to get rid of that disease. These diseases don't exist in the rich countries, including in the United States. And so the normal market mechanism that if people want something, they speak with their money, which is the volume of their voice in the marketplace, and the right thing happens. That works in terms of how many Thai restaurants should you have, how many laundry mats should you have, but it doesn't work for some very fundamental things like diseases of the poor. It doesn't even necessarily work perfectly for diseases of the rich, but it works particularly badly for disease of the poor. And so seeing that, my wife and I said, okay, let's make this our primary cause. About 75% of our resources go against that. So it means that there's about 16 different diseases, HIV, TB, malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia, malnutrition, that we have teams up at our foundation who are working to provide grants, both on new tools, breakthrough tools, but also on the delivery, so we can take whatever tools we have and get them out, in the case of childhood diseases, to every child in the world, which in many cases, it's a vaccine, and young children at 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 14 weeks come in and get a series of vaccines, and we've been adding to those. We've added 3 new vaccines just in the last decade that have had a pretty dramatic effect. And so our goal is that this inequity, that poor people are more at risk of suffering disease, that we would get rid of that entirely. And we are making progress. In 1990, 13 million children under the age of 5 died. So that's the birth cohort at that time was about 138 million. So you had a 10% death rate for children under 5. In some countries, it was as high as 25%, which is horrific. It's actually less than the death rate in the richest country in the world 100 years ago. So there, the worst country today is better than the best country was 100 years ago. From 1990, at that 10% rate, 13 million, we're now down at a 5% rate. That is less than 6 million. And a primary reason for that is the new vaccines that have gotten out there and cut, in that case, that's pneumonia and diarrhea. Then in the case of malaria, we've had bed net distribution that's cut that number in half. And we have a variety of programs that, not entirely us, but our foundation working with partners who are almost entirely governments. There's some other foundation work in this area, but it's not a huge portion of the money. Anyway, our goal is by 2030 that we'll get that number down to 3 million. So that's 2.5% of the kids in the world. And that will make the world as good as the United States was back in 1960. So still not as good as the United States is. The US is about 1% at this point, which is mostly congenital, very hard, worth working on, but there's no vaccine that's going to magically solve that. So that's the biggest thing we do. And some of it, goes quickly. Some of it, like say finding a HIV vaccine, is very important. I'm very optimistic, but it's taking a lot longer than we expected. So it's a variety of portfolios, and so I go around the world seeing the programs, working with various countries, finding the scientific groups that can help us out.
Okay, so I asked about curiosity, and you just used the word optimism. And as I heard you sort of talk through the sort of catalog of diseases and conditions that you're contending with, these have been some of the most intractable problems of our time. And I wonder, the work of the Gates Foundation is extraordinary in many ways, but in some respects, the most extraordinary thing about it is just the sheer optimism that drives it. And I wonder how you sustain that optimism. Surely there are setbacks, and how do you come to terms with those? Yeah.
Well, there certainly are setbacks. Of all the programs that has been the most difficult, actually, is our US program, which is about 25% of our resources are going in to improve education, particularly inner city education, both through trying to help teachers learn from each other and use better curriculum and digital tools in that context for things like personalized learning. That has been frustrating. The aggregate test scores of the nation over the last 25 years is basically the same. There's a slight improvement. There's an improvement. Dropout rates have gone down, and that's something to be proud of. But overall, the education system in absolute hasn't changed that much, and relative to some others who put far less resources in, including many of the Asian systems, including Singapore, Korea, and large parts of China, they've done far better than we have. And so, it's not bad for them to do good, it's good for them to do good, but it's the fact that best practice exists makes you wish you could at least get to that frontier of execution. So yes, some things are hard, but the world over a 200, 120-year period has improved very dramatically. And so to be an optimist is a very objective thing. Now, you don't want to be Pollyannish and think that things get better just naturally. It partly is that we worry about things, that things get better. So you have to worry about climate change in order to motivate yourself to do things get better. My favorite example of this is well explained in one of my favorite books, Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, that if you say to people, is this the most violent era in history? Overwhelmingly, people will say yes. Well, what that means is that their tolerance for the current level of violence, they hate it. It's way beyond what they want it to be, therefore they have this desire to get it to go down. In fact, this is the least violent time in human history. Against most times in human histories, it's about a factor of 100 less violent. That is, the chance of dying a violent death, the number of violent deaths is 1% of what it was even during the last parts of the last 500 years. So people's perception about how much things are improving often is more driven by the comparison to expectation than it is by a well-informed sense. And so in things like health and literacy and even equality of incomes on a global basis, what's happening really is quite phenomenal. You can argue, like Robert Gordon does in his book, that is it going as fast? And yes, the 1900s were this amazing period, and he focuses mainly on the US, the electrification, the car. There were a lot of incredible things, and are the current miracles as good as those miracles? My view is yes, but it's a bit subjective because these are all unique things. There's nothing like, no, cars aren't going 1,000 miles an hour now, but the fact that we can deal with cancer much better, or that gay rights, we treat that far better today, or that digital technologies let me exercise my curiosity, or anyone who has access can. I see the world as improving pretty rapidly. We have to think of the downsides of all these new things, which are often there. But overall, I have this incredibly positive view, and that's, our foundation, just tries to accelerate things. All the things we're doing would happen eventually. There would eventually be an HIV vaccine, even if we weren't there as the primary funder. There would be a malaria set of tools, even if we weren't there as the primary funder. But if you can get those things done, say 20 to 30 years sooner, which is more of an acceleration, whatever happens in IT, any individual, it's hard to say they accelerated things more than 3 or 4 years. In disease, actually, if you do the right things, you can actually time warp it by even 20 or in a few cases 30 years.
Thinking again about our audience, and I can't thank you enough for making the keynote kind of public event of your visit to Caltech an event for our graduate and undergraduate students. Reflecting on your own optimism, would you say you're more or less optimistic than you were when you were an undergraduate student?
Well, I'm more optimistic. I have a broader view of the world today. When I was an undergraduate, I knew a lot about software, and I was just fanatical. That was the primary thing I was interested in, and I was optimistic about software, but I didn't think about how are people living in Asia. You could have asked me what percentage of kids die under 5, or what the American foreign development budget was, or even how much had steel fabrication improved. I wouldn't have had a sense, that broad sense of things. I knew that innovation was important, but I was in a hurry. I thought somebody might realize how great microprocessors were and software were, and I wanted to get there. That's the reason I didn't finish my undergraduate career. They were feeding me. It wasn't perfect food, but it was okay. And there were smart people around. If it wasn't for the fact that getting a software company to be out in front felt like there was no room for delay, I would have finished my time as an undergraduate, because that, it's lots of fun just taking courses and getting generally nice feedback about papers that you hand in. So it was great. But so no, I didn't have a sense of the world. I even would have thought it was a strange question to answer if you'd asked me some macro type picture. And even in my 20s and 30s, concepts like vacation or I was a software person, and so it's kind of nice now. I'm not as making the same individual contribution fanatically, but I can fund fanatics now.
That's great. So switching gears a little bit, one of the things you've been stressing in a number of places, and you had a blog post about this recently, is the importance of governments investing in basic research and development. You wrote that innovation starts with government, which isn't necessarily what everyone believes. And I wonder why you think it's so important for governments to invest in R&D.
Well, certainly since World War II, whether you look at computer science or medical science, the basic research investments of governments broadly, where the US government is a dramatic, like over half of that, it has been a key reason why things have improved so much. And there still, in economics, is a problem that the value of innovation is risky, and so what portion of society's research you put into it? The private firm model grossly underinvests because something like electricity or combustion engine or even breakthrough medicines, the person who invents it gets such a small portion of the rewards that you'll tend to underinvest. The energy field is particularly dramatic in this because you can invent something, like Rudolf Diesel invents the diesel engine. He's broke, he commits suicide. About 30 years later, it's the primary thing powering ships and trains and things like that. So he got no benefit from it. Even if he'd stayed alive and patented in that 20-year time frame, he would have had essentially no benefit. So things that have long time frames that energy and some basic tools tend to have, then in particular, some mix of government and philanthropy needs to come in and provide those resources to have an overall view that's not as purely market driven. And so particularly when you have something like climate change, where you want research to move fast and you want to pursue lots of paths and tilt the odds so that you have a probability of success, then I think basic research is super important. The success of Microsoft and the whole, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, which are now it's very strange. The 5 most valuable companies in the world are those 5 companies. The 6th most valuable is Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, which is a very different company. But it was the government research in terms of chips and optic fibers that laid the groundwork. Even the internet itself, it was called the ARPANET because it was DARPA, who's a particularly enlightened government research funding agency, to this day, per dollar, probably the best that there is. They created those base things. And so without that, the American leadership and the benefits of those companies having that success, certainly wouldn't have happened in the same way. Likewise, in medical technology, the understanding of gene sequencing, which actually Lee Hood was here when he was one of the people doing that early work, that was government money that's led to that. And now when we look at genetics, not just for human disease, but part of our foundation works on agriculture, the ability to understand plants, prevent plant diseases, improve agricultural productivity, which in Africa is 1/5 of what it is in the US, do that so we actually use less acreage, so environmentally that we're better off. It's that genetic miracle that again goes back to the government. And it's easy to lose sight of that because you put the money in, and during even say 8 years of somebody being president, the money you put in up front, you're not going to see something there. The moonshot, which Kennedy was able to articulate in '62 that he would do it by the end of the decade, that's pretty unusual that something can happen that quickly. A lot of these things are more like a 15 to to 20-year time frame. So unless the electorate is pretty enlightened and really encourages this stuff, you'll tend to underinvest.
I was thinking of following up with a question about how that might shape our lives at Caltech, but I think you addressed that. At this point, I want to move on to some particular questions from our students who are here and who had the chance to submit these in advance. So this is a question from Clement Sid, who's an environmental science and engineering graduate student. I hope you're out there, Clement. How do you translate innovation, he wants to know, from the IT sector to other sectors such as development, health, or education?
Well, the IT sector is pretty phenomenal in that it becomes the tool that researchers are using. You know, we couldn't deal with genetic data and find the patterns and understanding and get sort of systems level knowledge unless there'd been a mind-blowing IT revolution. It would be too many numbers for us to deal with. Likewise, if we look at what we're doing for financial services, our foundation is involved in getting digital money onto cell phones in India and Africa so that you can loan money or send money and the transaction fees are less than 1%. Classic banking, where you're using paper currency, when you're dealing with small amounts of money, the fee structures will tend to make the transactions non-economic. They'll be over 20%. And so it just doesn't happen. And so when we look at that cell phone infrastructure, it's incredible. We can take everybody who visits a primary healthcare facility and sample, not everyone, but statistically sample enough to see, are they getting good service? Were the drugs there? Was the wait time low enough? We can call up women and ask about contraception use. Is it available? Did they feel coerced in terms of what they're doing? We can also track money. If we're granting money in digital money, you can have it as it transfers from one person to the other, gather evidence in real time of where were they, when was it transferred. You can insist a photo be taken of the gas they claim that they're filling their Jeep up with. And so this digital stuff, it's hard to overstate how valuable it is in agriculture, in finance. I guess sanitation is the one area that the digital stuff isn't that overwhelming. We're trying to reinvent the toilet so that these big urban areas, including the slums, have good sanitation. But in almost everything we do, satellite photography to see crop health and productivity, one of the edges we have as a foundation is going to the best digital people and saying, okay, let's bring this together early. Let's not just wait for a long time, even kind of trickle down. Digital currency has happened in poor countries, and it hasn't happened yet in rich countries. And in places like Somaliland and Kenya, we have over 100% of GDP being exchanged digitally, which those are the only countries that's happened because the risk of inflation and stuff being stolen and the fact that there's no checking or credit card equivalent meant that we were able to bootstrap that digital approach. So the only thing that's more primary than digital is improving education, but digital helps you in many, many areas.
So another question, this is from Timothy Liu, who's a junior at Caltech, majoring in electrical engineering. Timothy asks, President Obama, this is a political question, recently wrote an opinion piece in The Economist where he stated, too many potential physicists and engineers spend their careers shifting money around in the financial sector instead of applying their talents to innovating in the real economy. Any thoughts from you on this issue?
Well, I wouldn't complain too much about the finance sector taking all the smart people. I mean, it is a little bit zero sum in a way. I remember when my mom said to me that she was having this event that Warren Buffett was coming to, and I'd never met him. And I said, well, I don't need to meet him because it's no value added to buy and sell stocks. That's almost parasitic in nature. Yes, good pricing information maybe allocates resources, okay, but that my thing is actually building things. And so, well, I was wrong. Then I met Warren, and he asked questions. He had a model of the world, how firms should work, how firms should be managed. And he, over time, actually now has more owned businesses where he's running them in this superior fashion. And so anyway, I loved the way he thought about things and value added. He wasn't just somebody who was doing securities. It is interesting, when I took the Putnam at Harvard, and a lot of the guys who did well did go to Wall Street. So for a while I felt like, is that where the IQ of the nation should be going? That's gone down somewhat, and I don't think we need to restrict it. We do need to turn out more people with deep math skills, and we need to take the big data learning type approaches and get them into areas like the social sciences to understand poverty and help us out in ways other than just pricing financial instruments properly. I don't think we need, because we can grow that capacity, I don't think we need to somehow restrict the flow into those that vertical.
So another question, this comes from Colin Davda, who's a junior at Caltech, majoring in chemistry. Interesting question. What is one or more non-academic life skill that you wish you had learned earlier in your life?
Well, most of them. I thought being good at taking tests really was sort of the primal skill. Turned out that was wrong. But when I was a student, I procrastinated because I could get things done at the last minute. I was kind of rude. I didn't differentiate between the way I was tough on myself about when my thinking was sloppy versus being tough on other people. And so, both at Microsoft and then even more so as I've gotten almost mature, at the foundation where you're assembling even a more diverse set of skill groups. When at Microsoft, it was still a lot of the key people were people like me, engineers writing software and that kind of give and take. It wasn't perfect. I think I could have done better even there. But particularly now that it's people who go and live their life working in the field and aren't in this intellectual sword fight kind of paradigm. The idea of how you draw those people in and how you show that you value those diverse skill sets, I'm still trying to get good at that. Building partnerships. There were some aspects of that I learned at Microsoft as we worked with lots of companies, but now, poor country governments, UN agencies, lots of diverse types of organizations. I've had to learn about that quite a bit. So, dealing with people, how you get the best out of them, how you build teams, that's all been trial and error. And I undervalued those skills. In the early Microsoft, my view was that if you worked for somebody, they should have a higher IQ than they did. It was rude to make somebody with a higher IQ work for somebody with a lower IQ. But then I realized that there's many dimensions of business capabilities, and that wasn't going to work. At about 20 employees, that started to break down. Because unfortunately, there's actually a negative correlation to some degree in certain types of smarts and being good at managing. I don't know why. It actually makes no sense to me because you should be able to have intelligence be fungible. It's way less fungible in the general population than it should be. I was lucky that Microsoft's insight about what was important was strong enough that we could survive a lot of mistakes in terms of how we organized, how we worked with people, how we led things, and developed enough maturity to do that in a decent way.
Now, as you seem to be describing a situation in which your approach to managing and working with others has changed over time, and I wondered, is that still an evolving thing for you, or do you feel?
Well, I hope so. my wife gives me lots of feedback about when I'm too intense. You can be not intense enough, or you can be too intense. I rarely make the mistake of not being intense enough. I'm waiting for her to tell me, hey, you were just way too friendly today. Come on. You let those guys get away with murder. They're wasting our money. You should have spoken up. I haven't, as I calibrate, maybe I'll find at least one data point in that regime. But so, yeah, and I've always had a group of people, at Microsoft in the early days, Paul Allen, then Steve Ballmer. Those were my primary partners, but there were lots of people, and you want to have people around who can give you feedback that, first of all, they understand domains that you don't understand as well, about people and sales and lots of things. And they know some of your weaknesses, that you will tend to be over-optimistic about things. And so they'll say, well, maybe we need a backup plan, or maybe it'll actually take 5 years instead of 3 years to get this thing done. And so I think you do get a lot wiser about having the mix of those skills. You're not going to have it all in yourself. You can get better about those things, but and now at the foundation, I have a really amazing group of people. Sue Desmond-Hellman's the CEO, my wife Belinda, but a whole, even 40 or 50 people that are quite fantastic as we tackle these problems together.
So this question comes from Anshul Ramachandran, who's a junior majoring in computer science and chemistry. And he wants to know, what are 3 upcoming fields in science and technology that are going to impact society and the world the most quickly? And as a professor, this is, to me, a familiar style of Caltech student question. I'm sure he'd be happy with 2 or 4. He asked for 3.
Well, in biology, things like gene editing, understanding the microbiome, we're beginning to understand some fundamental things, which in terms of even ritual diseases like neurological or cancer, this is a phenomenal time for those things. The infectious diseases will make even faster progress on, because in a sense, they're low-hanging fruit. They just didn't get enough work. They're actually easier than some of the more chronic diseases. So biology as a whole is pretty fascinating, what's going on. If we can improve education, that's a primal thing that takes all your human resources and makes it more effective. So that would be a really phenomenal thing. I have to say, I think the thing that's moving the fastest, and this either may show my bias towards my digital roots, I think artificial intelligence is the biggest change agent right now. I hope we can add to this list a breakthrough in energy, because we actually both to avoid climate change, reduce local pollution, and to make energy cheaper, which is very fundamental for poor people. Poor people are more energy intensive because food, transport, shelter are a bigger part of their missing needs than it is as you get into middle income countries and up. But so as much as I love the biology stuff, and I actually spend a lot of time on malnutrition, prematurity, things that we're just now unlocking the mysteries of, it's artificial intelligence that's moving at a really rapid pace. And in fact, in the last 10 years has actually accelerated. Even when I started Microsoft, the dream was to do artificial intelligence, to understand cognition and have the computer be, pass the Turing test or more. And the rate of progress, even on the domain-specific things like speech and vision, was pretty modest, like 2% a year improvements. Now a combination of newer techniques, including deep learning, and the computing power that we bring to bear on it is causing very rapid advance. So we're now at the point where computers can see better than humans. You know, Microsoft just announced a result that computers can listen better than humans. And if you add that to eventually arms and legs, then you reach a milestone in terms of certain capabilities. So the amount of innovation and the pace of innovation, contrary to what some observers say, I believe is faster today than ever. And any one of these fields, I think, would be enough to keep me excited. But I see it in every field, and it's somewhat self-reinforcing because, in computation, deep learning, and perhaps eventually quantum computing will give us tools to understand those other areas.
Okay. Another political question. This one comes from Jenny Sheng, who's a senior majoring in applied physics. How do we get politicians to act on the issue of climate change when half of the country and one of the major political parties thinks that it's a hoax?
Yeah, politics is one of those things that could confuse you about whether things are getting better or not. And democracy's dealing with complex long-term issues, whether it's climate change or medical costs or education personnel systems. Government, because it generally does things in a monopoly context, it's often very inefficient. And even these insights, like agreeing that we need to do something about climate change, is not as strong as we'd like. We did reach a good milestone. The Paris Agreement got signed. I was involved in a piece of that where 20 countries agreed to double their energy R&D budgets, including all the major countries. US, Japan, China, Germany, UK agreed to do that. So that, I think that's a leading thing that we need, because our goal in climate change is zero carbon emission because of the long residence time, specifically of CO2. A lot of the things people view as low-hanging fruit don't get you to the solution. And so you could do a lot of efficiency, but that doesn't get you to zero unless you have a source, among other things, for electricity that literally is zero. And of course, you have to have that in a reliable form. I think, President Obama's made a real effort here. I hope the next administration continues to make an effort. Doubling the energy R&D budget is a good thing. Some of the tax policies that have accelerated the adoption of renewables, those have been a very good thing. You get to the point where it's the intermittency, even if the price went down, you still have the intermittency problem. So tax resources at some point should focus on the solutions to the intermittency or other paths, like solar fuels that don't have or nuclear fission that don't have an intermittency problem. And we need to pursue all those things in parallel. I do think the financial crisis was very unfortunate because attitudes towards climate actually had improved a lot in the decade up to the financial crisis. When you get something like that, people's time scale tends to scope in. And so telling them, okay, there's a big problem in 40 or 50 years that we need to do something about now, it's easier to not pay attention to when there's a sense of crisis, legitimately a sense of crisis. And so hopefully, if we have stability and don't have these short-term problems, those attitudes and willingness to invest will go up. It really is up to science, though, to give us the breakthrough solutions. The paradigmatic way to think about this is to look at India and say that electrification is good for them. The benefits to the people who live there, even of coal-created electricity, in terms of air conditioning and lighting, things we take for granted, they are so incredible that you really can't say to them, particularly given that they're sovereign, don't do it. So it's incumbent upon the world at large, particularly the rich countries that have emitted so much and have the scientific power, to invent something that for them, even though it's more expensive in its learning curve, it's got to be, including reliability, cheaper than that coal solution. And so the sooner we're able to create that, both through the science and the practical engineering and the learning curve to get the cost down, and provide that, then we'll have a solution. If you don't have something that meets those parameters, I just don't see it, because without that, they have a strong political argument that they should continue, in the case even stronger as you look at countries that are less well off than they are, which is, of course, about half of humanity. So this is a tough one. If it wasn't for science, if you said there will be no innovation, we've got the current things to work with, I think we'd have a potentially unsolvable dilemma, because there are so many paths of innovation that get us there. You know, I've got a company doing nuclear fission stuff that looks very promising. It's still got some challenges, but you know, that's one of many, many paths that should be pushed forward.
Yeah. It's interesting that you ended on many paths, and you mentioned zero emissions early in what you just said. We hear a lot about reducing carbon emissions, and you have often written and spoken about zero being kind of the only goal that is going to matter. Could you talk a little about why you feel that way and why it doesn't lead you to despair as it might lead others?
Oh, I do think we'll get there. There are many sources of greenhouse gases. And so, for example, livestock and land use is over 20%. A lot of that is happening in the poor countries. And it's not easy to go and say to them, hey, your cow is belching methane, you know, get rid of your cow. And you know, that's a fairly inherent process. People have tried to, you know, change the feed or put a candle on the back and front of the cow, and it's just, so far, that cow's a net greenhouse emitter. And so because of those things, and because the poor countries, in terms of their transport infrastructure or diesel engines, they are going to lag, there's no doubt the US has to get to zero. In fact, the people who try to show that we can meet a 2-degree scenario are now forced to show years that we're going to be globally in negative carbon emissions, which isn't a scientific impossibility. I fund a company called Carbon Engineering that's a free air capture, but it's very expensive today. And you know, it's not clear to me that in this 100-year period of relevance that will be solved. And so the US has to get to zero. And for the US to get to zero, it means that we have to source our electricity at zero, and we have to convert the transport sector either to fuels that are net zero, or electrify the transport sector, connecting up to that zero CO2 electric sector. So there's 2 paths that one can go down. The biofuels path, in some ways, or solar fuels, however, the carbon neutral fuels is an easier path because you're using the existing infrastructure. But either one is fine, and we don't know enough today to know which one it'll be. If we're still emitting, say, 20% of what we are today, then temperature just keeps going up. There's this huge lag factor in terms of the forcing effect, and there's this mind-blowing uncertainty of how much temperature maps to various weather conditions. You know, in terms of pure heat and humidity, we understand that. Once you get into things like ecosystems, where you have forest die-offs or permafrost methane release, there are various feedback things that most of which are bad for us. That is a positive feedback cycle that makes things worse. And so we have to be the exemplar. We have to get to zero. And that means that efficiency doesn't really get there. If you have zero CO2 electricity, then go ahead, use electricity. That's okay. So let's put the resources into, you know, taking those numbers we have to multiply together and having one of them be zero.
Okay, another question from a student. This is from Charles Nelson, who's a junior majoring in computer science. And I think this is a question that connects with a number of Gates Foundation's initiatives, particularly your support for the online Global Citizen Project. He wants to know, how do we get people to believe in greater ties with the rest of the world in the face of an increasingly segmented and fragmented culture?
Well, I don't think the world is more segmented and fragmented. I mean, urbanization is this incredibly powerful force. And when when somebody like myself goes to visit poor countries, you almost get confused because you go out to the rural area and it looks kind of nice. And then you go into this slum where the crowding and noise and sanitation just looks awful. But the actual lack of freedom, where you're stuck in a certain structure and your opportunity to do things or to relate to peers is so limited in those rural areas, the people are very rational, even though it's not immediately obvious that they're moving into those cities. Now, we have to make those cities really good. But in terms of reducing, say, caste-type views, cities are amazing. In terms of getting people, if they are from different backgrounds, different culture, to see things and work together, cities are absolutely phenomenal. Now, at first, you have people in proximity, and that can be very explosive. But over time, the intermarriage, friendships, it tends to bring things together. And so the internet should be a tool to make the world smaller in terms of those differences and those understandings. Now, there is this concern that everybody's walling themselves off into their, what their friends like on Facebook, and so you're just more reinforced. I think that's legitimate to have that concern. I'm not sure things will naturally go that way, but it's great that people are discussing it. In most poor countries, the amount of ethnicity and distrust is going down as they get wealthier. Certainly gender equality is extremely correlated with development. That is, women have an even worse situation in condition of poverty. The slogan we use for that is that poverty is sexist. So, I think that lifting everybody up, getting everybody to be literacy, getting people not to have to worry about food, over time then having the education and kind of internet access that we take for granted, I do think that's a positive formula that can work out. There's the few footnotes are if you look at democracies that are a little bit turning inward now, but that's kind of minor, and it's across a trend line that I think will resume. And you look at this, people walling them off into their own places, and that political phenomenon, that walling off, are somewhat related to each other. That's the one thing where I think, we have to avoid that.
Okay, maybe time for one or two more questions. It'll depend on how expansive you are. So this comes from Eric Jew, who's a bioengineering graduate student. He writes, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has made great efforts towards reducing inequality globally. But what are your thoughts about inequality within the United States?
Yeah, the U.S. Hasn't achieved its ideal of equal opportunity. We're better off than we were 50 years ago or 20 years ago. And if I had one wish that would help with this, it would be about the public education system, that the inner city schools would provide the same type of rich experience and building of self-confidence and discipline that the highest quality suburban schools or their equivalents in Asia are able to provide. I think that alone would do a lot. If you look at poverty in the US, there are many things that are somewhat creating poverty traps. Education, the fact that inner city education is not good, you don't have role models, you have lots of stress. Some of that despair leads to use of drugs or alcoholism. And then you have people who just for pure health reasons, whether mental health or others, are in a very, very tough situation. And I do think government, this is a case where government does, given its role in funding medical care and funding education, government needs to get better. And government may need net, as a percentage of GDP, more resources to do these things, particularly in a society where the people with the globally desired skills are separating themselves in terms of both income and wealth from the average somewhat. Now, this last year was a counter trend in that, but if you take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's a pretty pronounced trend. I'm kind of the extreme case of that, although if I give enough away, then it offsets it a little bit.
Okay, I think we have time for another question. And this one comes from Carrie Hernandez, who's a chemical engineering graduate student.